Welcome back to the Gaming News Canada show. I'm your host, Steve McAllister. Before we introduce our very special guest on today's podcast, we have a couple of announcements with regards to this particular media outlet. We're thrilled to have Dave Briggs join Gaming News Canada this week as the editor of our newsletter, which will be distributed on Wednesdays and Fridays. Also this week, GBG PLC returns as presenting sponsor of Gaming News Canada for both the newsletter and the podcast. We're incredibly grateful to both Rebecca Jackson and Rebecca Angus from GBG for collaborating with us to promote the work the UK-based company is doing in Canada. Okay, back to today's show. In October, BCLC hosted its annual New Horizons and Safer Gambling Conference, and last week, the sports betting and gaming industry in the United Kingdom and Ireland held its annual Safer Gambling Week. Responsible gambling and player protection, it seems, is often front and center these days, and to get his perspective and share with our audience his expertise, we welcome back to the Gaming News Canada show the Director of Player Health for BCLC, Ryan McCarthy. Hey Ryan, before I hit the record button, you reminded me this is your return to the podcast, but I guess it was just a little bit over a year ago that you joined us here.
Absolutely, it was just before my inaugural New Horizons with BCLC, and we've just held the second version with myself. So looking forward to debriefing.
Hey Ryan, why don't we start right there and just the New Horizons conference, I think kind of it attracts a who's who from the Canadian gambling industry. Many panels a couple back in October during the conference. Were there some key takeaways from you from the time you spent with your peers across the industry?
Absolutely, I would say there's kind of three themes that emerged during the conference. We had Dr. Shawn DuBravac open the conference for us and talked about this concept of kind of iterating at a 1% rate. And so he gave a lot of really great examples of how you have to really balance your short-term revenue goals and your short-term business needs with kind of the long-term vision. And I think for a lot of us in the safer gambling space, it really resonated around, we like to try and boil the ocean because there are so many great things and so many great ideas and innovations in this space. But it was a good reminder that if you actually just do 1% increments, they often add up over time. And the example that he gave was around the British cycling team. And they had a coach that came on board and literally would look and tear everything apart piece by piece, everything from sleep to medications to training. And they noticed that just those 1% incremental changes really did make a difference. And I heard a lot of the delegates talking about that throughout the conference. So that was the first area. I think the next one is that we need to really innovate, but iterate. So rather than just going for the big thing, we need to really focus on the small pieces that we can do. We need to kind of pace it out a little bit and not necessarily go for the big shiny objects. As I called out on one of the panels, we do have bright shiny object syndrome, which means we often chase the newest thing and we all want to do the funnest thing. And sometimes that's not really the best way for us to go. And I think finally, no conference would be complete now without talking about AI. But when we talked about AI, the thing that really struck me is the need to not lose that human connection. So from a player protection standpoint, we have a lot of these systems now where you can identify high-risk behaviors. You can do it kind of further up the player journey, if you will. But at the same time, it tells you where players are at in their behavior, and it tells you where they've come from. But what it doesn't tell you is why they're actually behaving that way. So if you're going to do a meaningful intervention, you can't lose that human connection. And so those were kind of the three takeaways that I took from the conference overall.
That seems to be such great advice, Brian, about not trying to hit the home run with one swing, because it feels right now, if you talk to people, we've seen a lot of media coverage here in Canada the last couple of weeks. We had Paul Burns on the podcast a week or so ago, and the CBC just did on their current show interviewed a problem gambler, and the Athletic just ran a major feature on someone who was addicted to sports betting. We just saw Bill S269 went through the Senate, and now the Globe Mail had an editorial over the last couple of weeks calling for the federal government to pass S269 in a hurry to create a national framework for sports betting advertising. There's not an easy fix here, or there's not a matter of snapping your fingers to eliminate problem gambling, correct?
No, there isn't. And one of the things that came out at the conference, and even one of the things I've been saying in this space, is that we have to innovate, iterate, but also evaluate. Because I think one of the things that we try to do is, whether it's through regulation or whether it's through our own efforts, we implement player protection measures, whether that's land-based or online. And there isn't a lot of evidence right now. I mean, sports betting, for example, is an area where we know that there are potential harms. We know that there's risks, and those are starting to come out in the research, but we're catching up. And one of the things that struck me is prior to New Horizons, I was at the International Association of Gaming Regulators conference. And one of the things that struck me in those conversations is that even regulators are really struggling to kind of catch up with the innovations in the industry. And so I think it's really important when we're having these conversations that they're measured and that we don't get too heavy-handed, because there's also unintentional consequences.
It's
So
interesting. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, Ryan. I just read this morning that that the Australian government they were going to impose a ban on sports betting advertising in 2025, and they've pulled back on that and delayed it because there has been pushback from the media industry. And as you know, the media industry benefited, especially here in Ontario, benefited an awful lot coming out of COVID with the opening of the regulated marketplace in Ontario and having so many operators in the marketplace here. So, and again, I think that's when you talk to people like Paul Burns and yourself and talk to others in the industry, there really doesn't appear to be a lot of concrete evidence out there right now, with regards to the impact that advertising might have on player behavior.
for sure, and I think that it's something that we need to really be careful around, making sure that the evidence is solid and we actually know what's happening. And this is one of the areas, for example, at the conference, one of the panelists gave the example in Australia of some of the measures around talking to players, for example, after they've been gambling for a certain amount of time in venue. Players start to learn what that means. And so they'll actually physically get up from machines and change so they don't have to have a conversation or an intervention. So people learn, people figure out how to get around systems if that's what's happening. And I think, as we see the evolution in the industry, we just need to be careful around coming too hard on one side or the other. And one of the things that I've been saying, for example, even around things like incentivization, it's not an either or, right? It's not, we can actually do two things at once. People aren't stupid, they can figure it out. So you can incentivize and send a safer gambling message. There's ways to actually engage with your players so that you're not patronizing them and talking down to them, but actually making sure that you're sending those kind of player protection messages at the same time. And it's all about evaluating the effect.
You joined BCLC in August 2022, so I'm assuming this would have been your third New Horizons conference since joining the Lottery Coalition in British Columbia. Have the conversations changed over those three conferences, Ryan? And again, when you're talking to people from various sectors of the industry, what do those conversations sound like?
I think there has been a change. When I joined BCLC 2 years ago, I think there was a lot of talk of kind of the traditional RG measures. So a lot of talk about tools, a lot of talk about what we should or shouldn't be doing. I'm hearing a lot more around innovations around behavior change and attitudinal change. So I think people are taking a more behavioral based approach in this space, which is really encouraging to hear. I think the other thing that we're starting to talk about more is to really meet players where they're at. And so it's not necessarily taking heavy-handed approaches and thinking a one-size-fits-all approach is going to work. It really is about starting to understand your players, where they're coming from, why they make decisions the way that they do. And all of that kind of information is going to help you in interacting with your players in the best way at the best times with the right messaging, versus just one kind of heavy-handed approach where it's just a global approach that goes across different cultures, different communities, different genders. We know that people receive information in different ways, and a lot of that has to do with your culture and where you come from. So those behavioral drivers, I'm starting to hear people talk more about those kind of conversations in this space than I was 2 years ago, which is really encouraging.
And you're in a unique situation with BCLC, Ryan, where in Ontario you have, what do we have, 50, I think 51 operators in the market now, plus OLG. And I almost wonder sometimes, and we've talked about this on the podcast, there's so many different groups out there giving responsible gambling messaging. And I almost wonder if it's in a province like BC where there's only one legal operator, if it's maybe a little bit easier to cut through all that noise and to deliver a consistent RG message.
It is in some ways because we actually can be really consistent across our GameSense messaging. So GameSense, of course, is our responsible gambling program that we have here in British Columbia that's also licensed in 10 jurisdictions. But we're able to be really deliberate about the target audience. So for example, last year, sports betting or we call them segment 5, which is young men aged 19 to 35. We know that they're at higher risk for certain behaviors. We know that on the problem gambling severity index, which is a research measure that we use, they tend to score higher, which means that they're engaging in riskier behaviors. And so we were able to target a campaign specifically for that audience and kind of just target that market here in British Columbia. So to your point, it is a bit easier because even whether we're talking about online or in venue or lottery, because we have all three sectors and we kind of have a consistent RG message through GameSense, it is a bit easier in that way because we don't tend to get the RG messaging from Ontario. We get just the straight up advertising. So it gives us an opportunity to really be really consistent with our message. And then one of the other things that we try to deliberately do is that when we're doing those messages in market, we also do activations with our GameSense advisors, who are our player education folks that are situated in venue and also online. So they're able to also provide kind of player education that's consistent with the RG messaging that we're sending out through advertising. So it's more of a collaborative approach so that we're trying to target and hit those areas of concern for high-risk players.
Because BCLC, Ryan, oversees both online sports betting and gaming and also land-based gaming, do you have to tailor messaging? Again, I'm assuming that online gaming is more popular with young people, and since I started covering this industry years ago, the industry was talking when coming out of COVID is how do we get people back into casinos and kind of grow that demographic. And I assume that that also applies to responsible gambling and getting the right message to the right people.
It does. And one of the things that we have been focusing on over the past couple of years is really, and it's a pillar in our new player health strategy, is we have to better understand our players. So, for example, we have a large East Asian community here in British Columbia who are playing. We have a large South Asian population. We know that for Indigenous people, the player health issues look different. For young sports bettors, it looks different. And so we're really targeted in the way that we do that. So, for example, last year we did the Segment 5 campaign where we were really looking at sports betting. This year, we're actually focusing on older adults, and that'll be more focused in venue because older adults have unique player health issues if they're going to casino than someone who's gambling online. So I think going back to the New Horizons point, it was really, we have to meet players where they're at. And so for older adults, reaching them digitally is not necessarily the best way to do that. They want more traditional methods, but then sports betting, for example, we target mostly digital because that's where young people are. They're not watching Jeopardy at 7:30 at night, but they're actually on YouTube watching sports, streaming, and that's where you're going to reach them. So it's really, you have to target now and you have to be very specific about how you're reaching your audience and the kind of message that you're sending them, because also the same advertising or the same kind of advertisement that we would use for RG for young sports bettors is probably going to look a little bit edgier, a little bit more fun, incorporate humor, whereas older adults, the humor might be there, but the humor will look different. And that's just being cognizant of your audience and who you're talking to. And you want to meet them where they're at and kind of have that conversation. And that's really philosophically what we've been doing with GameSense over the past few years. It's really meant to be conversational. And so if you're going to be conversational with someone, you have to understand the kind of conversation they want to have.
A couple more questions on that, Ryan. I know OLG, I believe, has either expanded or opened new PlaySmart facilities at casinos in Ontario, and I know in Windsor, for example, and I believe with the new casino resort in Toronto, there's quite a it's pretty hard not to see the PlaySmart the PlaySmart venue. As BCLC, has there been some shift with your land-based casinos as well and making sure that you're getting in front of people with that messaging?
Absolutely. We have GameSense information centers in all 36 facilities across the province. So we have coverage in every venue. and GameSense advisors are scheduled based on when the player volumes are the highest. So we're very deliberate in making sure when GameSense advisors are actually staffed there. One of the things that we do try to do is we coordinate with whatever campaign we have going on. So whether it's around sports betting, whether it's around older adults. Last year we did financial literacy because we know that people's financial literacy can also indicate where they might be engaging in riskier behaviors. All of that's usually coordinated, and then our GameSense management team works very closely with the GameSense advisors in kind of providing that research-based evidence approach around the types of player education activities that they can engage in. So we're very deliberate, and the GameSense information centers will also collaborate a lot with the service providers in terms of where they're located in the facilities, making sure they're really visible, accessible, that they're really welcoming spaces for people, because we want people to come in, engage, and have conversations.
Are you seeing a bit more traffic, Ryan, with those facilities?
Yes, our numbers are up both in facility, and the other thing with GameSense is during COVID, we struck up a virtual service. And the whole point of that was, of course, facilities were closed. We were seeing a migration to online gaming.
Right.
And so we wanted to make sure that players were covered. The virtual program has stuck around and become quite successful. So our GameSense interactions, both virtually and land-based, are through the roof. They're up over 55,000, I think, this year. So we're seeing huge numbers of interactions with players, which is great.
And on the online sports betting side, again, I'm sure you've read the same stories I have about concerns about college students in the U.S. and the ease of use with online sports books now. Are you seeing any red flags in terms of the online sports betting? And are there certain areas like is there does in-play betting lead to maybe more examples of problem betting than maybe traditional betting where sports fans or sports bettors were putting money on a money line or an over-under?
So it's interesting. One of the things that we have been doing in the background as we prepare to get a behavioral analytics solution onto play now is we've been doing a couple of pilots, what we call high-risk indicators. So looking at the research literature, the first tranche that we did last year was around what we call the 95th percentile. So they were the highest risk players that we see. So things like wagering 2,700 times in one day, spending over 12 hours logged in, etc. And we've just finished a pilot and are now looking at sports betting because the indicators for sports betting from a high risk perspective look different. So it is things like wagering in game, and there's 4 indicators that we've identified that are the ones that show the highest risk. And so we're actually analyzing that right now to find out what that looks like for us and what are going to be the effective intervention points with players to actually get them to maybe gamble in safer ways when they're doing sports betting. Because it does look, with wagering in betting during the game, it does look different. The pressures are different. So for example, one of the things that we talked about with the GameSense advisors recently is, in many ways, group play is actually riskier for sports bettors. So they're playing together. There's a bit of peer pressure. It's almost like a game of one-upsmanship, if you will. And so we know that the behaviors look a bit different with sports bettors than they do with traditional online playing. And so we have to be really cognizant of that when we're trying to target our messaging for sports bettors, because the behaviors do look different and the evidence is still evolving. And so that's one of the reasons that we go back to, we have to innovate and iterate, because until the evidence catches up, we can't just sit and not do anything. We actually need to figure out how to have the most effective ways of trying to interact with those players to make sure that they're engaging in the safest way possible.
Yeah, and I think there's that danger of in-play betting with, where you get 3 in-play bets, so now you make 2 or 3 more in-play bets because you want to get even, and I think you end up someone could end up really, really chasing their tail and going into a bad spot.
Absolutely.
We had Brett Hansen on the show a while ago when Play Now released its new product, and I'm curious just the kind of conversations that are held within BCLC, because again, you have people on the product side who are trying to grow business. You have your compliance people, you have people like yourself on the player health side. How does that relationship work between the different sectors within BCLC?
We work really hard to build collaborative relationships because we know that the earlier we're in the conversations, the better the advice that we can give. If people start running down the road too fast and we have to play catch up, it can be a little bit problematic. But sports betting is a great example where we've actually collaborated with Brett and his team very early on and kind of advised on some of the player health considerations that they want to think about. And I think it's important to do a call out that we're not anti-revenue, so we're not the fund police,
Right.
which is something that we're always dealing with internally and externally. It's really about how you can make sure that you're putting in those player protections at the right point, and what are the trade-offs that you're making from a revenue perspective if there are some that need to be identified, and have those conversations. It's all about informed decision making. So it's where do you find the sweet spot where you're protecting the players, you're growing your revenue, and you're doing it in a responsible way, and you're doing it in a way that sustains your player base. Because we also don't want players to engage in really risky behavior and then we don't see them again because they've experienced significant gambling harms. So for us, it's about how do you find the balance about growing responsibly and sustaining your player base, and kind of finding that sweet spot so that people are still having fun with their gambling.
I do want to give congratulations to you and the other folks and being the best Flagship Responsible Gaming Award Level 4 from the World Lottery Association. That award was presented, which I think either November, late October, and I believe you were, I don't know, were you there to accept the award, Ryan?
Our CEO was, so thankfully he was there. It was a bit of a surprise. Apparently it's because you put your submission in and that's how you get nominated. So thankfully our CEO, Pat Davis, was there to accept the award, which was great. It was a wonderful surprise.
Hey, Ryan, your time joining BCLC kind of runs in, well, a little bit later of the party in terms of PASPA being overturned in the U.S. and we have 38 regulated sports betting states now in the U.S. We've got Ontario here. We know or figure that Alberta's going to take on a regulated industry next year. I look at the GameSense partnership with BetMGM and MGM Resorts. Just how much has that growth in regulated betting? I guess what are the opportunities for BCLC and for your job in particular? And then are there challenges from this explosion of regulated betting?
I think in some ways the opportunity is to continue to be thought leaders. I think BCLC has been really innovative in its approach to player health, and we're continuing to do that. We have a player health strategy that was passed by our board about 6 months ago, which really looks at 3 key areas for us. One is around better understanding our players. The second is personalizing their player health experience. So it's very much in keeping with our corporate strategy around personalization and verified play. And then third, around building that player health culture. So regardless of where the industry goes, for us, I think the building the player health culture is really a key piece, and that collaboration across the industry is essential, because I think this is one area where we don't actually compete, we collaborate. And I think that's a really important call out, that regardless of who's around the table, we're all considering player protections, we're all considering the best ways to do that, we're all seeing innovations in the space, and we're all, in some ways, we're all playing catch up because the industry is evolving so quickly, and we want to make sure that our players are playing in the safest way possible. So I think it's really about continuing to have that thought leadership piece. And one of the luxuries of being the manage and conduct organization for lottery, casino, and online is it kind of gives us some of that innovation space, because we have all 3 lines of business that we have to think about. So regardless of online explosions versus in venue play, we have to think about what's happening in all 3 sectors, and even think about cross-pollination in terms of ideas.
It's fine. And I won't ask you about this, but obviously we know there are tensions between some of the provincial gaming and lottery corporations and some of the operators. But when you look at the Canadian Gaming Summit back in June, and lottery corporations in the same room with the operators, and just talking to the people at SBC, the organizers of the Canadian Gaming Summit 2 weeks ago, they're going to expand that player protection symposium to the entree that's a conference in Toronto. But I would have to think it's beneficial to the entire industry to have the provincial coalitions or corporations and in the same room with operators and talking about what has to be the same problems, the same challenges, the same opportunities.
I think so. I think it's one of those collaborative conversations that has to happen. We're all innovating in this space, and the more we can learn about how to protect our players and encourage them around safer gambling, the better off we are. I mean, I always go back to, this is one area where we need to collaborate and not compete, because there's lots of innovations that operators are doing in different jurisdictions that we can always learn from. Are they always appropriate and applicable depending on our regulations? Not necessarily, but even knowing what's happening both nationally but then internationally, because a lot of operators that are operating legal in Ontario are actually operating in other jurisdictions, and we know that regulators often look to other jurisdictions to see what's happening, and then those jurisdictions or regulations might find their way over to Canada and find their way into provinces. So I think those conversations are actually critical in the player health space.
I'll just remind our audience, and because this is something that doesn't get talked about a lot, is the fact that Canada, thanks to in large part to BCLC and GameSense and OLG and PlaySmart, this country has a outstanding reputation when it comes to responsible gambling.
It really does, and we're often tapped. I'm tapped. I know some colleagues are also tapped to speak at conferences all the time about what's happening in Canada. And that's because we've really built, I think, a collaborative ecosystem around this area where it really is about collaboration and trying to build safer play for everybody, regardless of what jurisdiction you happen to be in.
Do you see any other differences, Ryan, to that with what you see with other countries and other jurisdictions? Like why are there other reasons why Canada is such a kind of seen as a leader or as a model for RG?
I think that we're not scared to innovate. And I think that one of the things that I have seen is that we do push the envelope in our thinking. And so we've kind of moved away from the traditional, just sign up for a tool, we'll do some RG advertising and then kind of shake our hands and say we've done it all. I think that what they're seeing in Canada is that we're taking very deliberative and innovative approaches in how we're meeting players where they're at. And we're actually also measuring stuff, which I think is also innovative. So a lot of operators are moving towards some kind of metrics. For example, here in BC, we use the Problem Gambling Severity Index and the Positive Play Scale, which are two research metrics that we monitor our players on a quarterly basis to see how they're doing in terms of high-risk behaviors, but also in terms of how they're engaging in safer ways with our products. And so that gives us insight into where we actually need to focus our efforts. And I don't know that a lot of operators internationally are doing that, where we really do focus in on how are our players doing and where can we meet them where they're at, and then how do we actually develop our programs, initiatives, and marketing initiatives to actually do that.
Brian, the relationship with BetMGM and MGM Resorts, I mean, has that relationship evolved or grown, or how are some of the ways that maybe you've worked with them to basically to have a win-win for both the corporation and for those two operators?
Yeah, we certainly have a great relationship with BetMGM and MGM for sure. And they're actually part of a community of practice of the 10 GameSense licensees that we have. And they came together actually right before New Horizons to talk about some areas where they might want to collaborate as a collective with GameSense. And so we work really closely with all 10 licensees, including BetMGM and MGM, to make sure that the GameSense brand is consistent across all the different jurisdictions, but also to talk about where are the opportunities to collaborate and learn from each other. So again, it's not a competition of who can do the best thing with GameSense, because quite frankly, a lot of the jurisdictions are doing really great things with GameSense. It really is about how do you bring everyone together and have those collaborative learnings. And I think the community of practice is relatively young. It's only in its second year, but there's lots of great things to come. There's lots of really good discussions around how they can collaborate and measure the success of GameSense across different jurisdictions with different approaches.
There has been some criticism along the lines of marketing and advertising that in Ontario that operators don't do enough to promote responsible gambling and commercials and other marketing endeavors. And we had Elaine McDougall and Shelley White from the Responsible Gambling Council on the podcast about a month ago now, and talked about their new partnership with MLSE. And it was neat for them with just watching a hockey a Leafs game last week to see the big green RGC logo on the end boards. Um, how is BCLC tackled responsible gambling with the partnerships that you have in the sports and entertainment and other, I guess, the media industry as well?
Yeah, it's something that we're looking to explore more. One of our partners in Alberta has actually got GameSense logos now on their helmets and their home team jerseys. So we are starting to see those collaborative relationships being built. And I think that we're looking at those, where can we have those activations here in BC? So those conversations are just starting to happen. We are seeing some really innovative approaches, and I like what RGC has been doing around trying to get those collaborative efforts happening more often. And I think that we need to start thinking about how we can actually collaborate more, not only within the industry, but even talking to government partners and other people who have kind of a prevention mandate to talk about where those collaborative messages can come from. So it doesn't need just to be BCLC, it could actually be BCLC and multiple partners, and whether that's sports, whether that's government, there's a whole raft of ways that we can actually go at this. And so those are some conversations that we're starting to have internally to figure out where those opportunities might lie and where we can go with them.
It does feel to me, Ryan, again, that I think, we see that whether it's a provincial lottery and gaming corporation or an operator in Ontario, that there are partnerships, whether it's the CFL and the BC Lions or the NHL, the NBA, Major League Baseball, that I think there is an obligation for teams and leagues to work with operators like yourself on that responsible gambling messaging, because and the leagues will point this out too, that they are benefiting from the revenue and from these partnerships. So I think they do share a responsibility to work with people like yourself and make sure that messaging is loud and clear.
Yes, and I think that they also understand it's really important from a sports betting perspective that those messages are concrete and they're out there, because again, it's about sustaining your player base. And if we're not sending the message about safer play and responsible gambling, that's problematic. So I think there's an understanding there, and those conversations are certainly continuing to happen.
Hey Ryan, last question. It's hard to believe, but the calendar turns on Sunday, and we're in the last month of 2024. I don't know where the last 12 months have gone by, but just what's your focus looking towards 2025, and what are some of the things that you and your peers are talking about right now as we move into a new year?
I think one of the big topics of conversation that I'm hearing nationally is around the high risk behavior piece. So a lot of us in the online gaming space are concerned about the high risk behaviors that we're seeing online. Not all players, again, it's like any other form of gambling. There's a small subset where there's significant harms, and then lots of people are able to use it as completely entertainment and they're having lots of fun, and that's exactly what we want them to do. But for those who might be experiencing some gambling harms, I think there's going to be a lot of focus coming up this year on tackling high risk behaviors. There's a lot of conversations happening about how far and how much, because one of the things that I say around the online gambling space is that it's very hard to determine when people are making choices that you don't necessarily agree with versus when someone is no longer in control of their choices. And as an operator, that's a very fine line, and there's lots of conversations about, should you limit play, should you stop incentivization, should you cut them off completely? And I think a lot of those conversations are happening here in BC, but they're happening all over the place, because I think from an online perspective, you have insights into people's behaviors because of all the great technology that we have, but it also means that we have a responsibility to look at what does that mean for us as an operator and what do we do about it. And so I think that's where the focus is going to be for us over the next year, is to try and figure out what that looks like, especially as we move more into the high risk behavior space.
Ryan McCarthy is the Director of Player Health for BCLC. Hey Ryan, you're one of those people that unfortunately, when we go to these conferences, there's so many people and things get so busy that I end up, when I leave these conferences on Thursday afternoon, I'm thinking, geez, I wish I'd grabbed Ryan and had the conversation for 5 or 10 minutes, because I always enjoy your insight on LinkedIn and of course when you do speak at this conferences. But as always, really appreciate your time, and look forward to getting you back on the podcast in 2025 as these new initiatives unfold.
Excellent. Look forward to it, Steve.
That's it for this episode of the Gaming News Canada show. As always, you can find us on Substack at gamingnewscanada.ca and also on all of the podcast platforms. Once again, really grateful to Ryan McCarthy for joining us on the podcast today, and we will see everybody again very soon.
Thank you for listening to the Gaming News Canada show. Sign up for our newsletter at gamingnewscanada.ca. Follow Steve McAllister on LinkedIn. Message Steve if you're interested in being a sponsor or featured guest.